Thank you so much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see a new group of people on a meeting. That's not the same group of people that I see every day or every week. So this is really exciting for me. Really enjoyed the conversations that I've had so far and the conversations I'll be able to have later as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, I'm assuming people can see that. We're good to go. Okay. So like Michael said, the title of my talk today and the topic overall is going to be around accessible virtual reality for people with limited mobility. So I'm going to get into that. But first, I kind of wanted to be able to provide just a little bit more background about me, who I am. So starting off with a little bit of my educational background. So before I was at the University of Washington, I received my bachelor's and master's in computer science from Bowling Green State University. Bowling Green is a small college town in Ohio that is close to home. I'm from Detroit originally, so that was really great for me. And then after that, I left and went to Washington. So I got my PhD in information science from the Information School at the University of Washington in 2018. And then after leaving there, I joined first as a postdoc in the Ability Group at Microsoft Research, and I'm now currently a senior researcher in the group since the last 3 or 4 months or so. And this is just a quick overview of the other people on the Ability team. Some of the people here is research you're going to hear mentioned as I talk about the different stuff that we've been working on. So there's Andy Bagel, Ed Kutro, Sasha Yunovich, Mary Ringo Morgus, myself, and John Tong. So I want to start off by providing an overview of what my talk is going to entail today. So first, anytime I like to do any of these presentations, I always like to talk a little bit about accessible computing. I think accessibility is something that people might have some idea around, but I don't think it's something that's as core to our HCI knowledge as it should be. And I know you've had Patrick and other people, Patrick Carrington and other people this quarter give talks. So there may be things that you've heard already in this space, but I think when it comes to accessibility, I don't think you can hear it too many times. So I'll talk a little bit about how I think about accessible computing. And then I'm going to lead that into kind of how does my thoughts about accessibility or accessible computing, how does that inform my research? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my overall research approach. And then from there, I'm going to talk about this notion of how do we move more towards accessible VR, primarily for people with limited mobility. And since this is ongoing work and things that are in flux, and since kind of midway through me working on this work, we went through this, shutdown with the COVID pandemic and everything. So a lot of the work that I would prefer to do of like in-person co-design type of things, we're not able to do, essentially over the past year or so due to the stay-at-home orders and the social distancing restrictions and things like that. But my plan there is to give you an overview or at least a little bit of information about some of the interesting problems that we've identified in this space. And I would love to kind of just have a broader conversation about what that might entail for more accessible VR interactions in the future. And then I'm going to end kind of talking about some other opportunities that exist. So some things that are outside my immediate research area, but things that I think would be really great and fruitful areas of research that people could chat about. So that's the overview of the talk. And I'm not sure how Q&A or things are going to go exactly, but I'm okay if there is something that I say and you want to interrupt me and ask a question, that's usually okay with me. So just let me know. But if we want to wait to the end to do questions, that works as well. So first, all right, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about accessible computing and kind of how I think about accessible computing. So I kind of like to start off with this definition, which is to say that I really think about accessibility in these kind of two ways. So one is this notion of like, well, how can we design computing devices and services to be usable by all people? And then the second part of that is, well, how can we use computing to also make the world more accessible to people with disabilities? So you can really look at accessibility in these two different ways. And there's been a lot of great work for a lot of years looking at, well, how can we think about accessible design and what does that mean to incorporate accessible design into the development of technology? So one really popular method that people have employed to do that is to look at universal design. So I have a definition here from universal design, which says that it's really the design of products and environments that can be used and experienced by people of all ages and abilities to the greatest extent possible without adaptation. adaptation. And the thing to notice of universal design is that it really comes out of architecture discipline. So it really, you could think of it as like, well, can we make built environments more accessible, and how we can have people be able to experience these things without requiring adaptation. And then when it comes to using universal design to create more accessible technologies, it just kind of gives you a lot of great stuff, right? So you can think of curb cuts as like a great example of universal design. It's probably the most canonical example that people use often. So you can make curb cuts, you can make it easier for people who use wheelchairs or other implements to be able to navigate safely from the sidewalk to the street. But then you can also get these carryover benefits that great for people on skateboards or bicycles, a person pushing a stroller, et cetera. And then same thing with closed captioning. So we can have text that represents audio that's happening on whatever program we might be watching, which is really great because you can make this content more accessible to people who may be deaf or hard of hearing. But it's also great if you're like up really late at night trying to get like a baby to sleep, but you want to just put something on the TV and you just turn closed captioning on, right? Or you're in a really crowded restaurant. Well, in the past life, you were at a really crowded restaurant and you wanted to watch something on TV, you would put the closed captionings on. So great stuff universal design gives us. So, but if we go back to this definition and we interrogate a little bit more, it asks this really interesting question. So I'm just going to read the definition again. So it says, the design of products and environments that can be used and experienced by people of all ages and abilities to the greatest extent possible without adaptation. So there's this really heavy emphasis that I put in a slide here on abilities, because it begs this question, like, well, what is ability in this case? How do we think about ability? How do we measure ability? What do we do with ability? So one of the ways that's really useful and that's been influential to the way I think about accessibility research is to incorporate a design approach called ability-based design. So ability-based design is a design approach that was formulated by Jake Robrock and colleagues. Jake was my advisor when I was at the University of Washington. And in ability-based design, what it does is that it gives computer systems options to understand what human abilities are required to operate an interactive system, and they're questioned, and then you want to understand how systems can adapt or be adapted to these alternative abilities. So it really puts the abilities part first in thinking about how you might want to design different technologies for people. So again, it's still this notion of like, okay, well, what is ability? And an example that comes out of this is, well, you can really just think of ability as possession of the means or skills to do something. And it could be anything, whatever task or whatever type of action you want to be able to perform. If you possess the means or skill to do something, you have the ability to do it. And then our notion of disability has also changed a lot over years. So this is kind of the working definition from the World Health Organization that they put out in 2001, which essentially shows that, disability is complex. It's actually not just something that's static, and it's not something that's within a person. It's actually something that has to do with different type of contextual and environmental factors that actually impact what makes something accessible and what is disabling to somebody in any given scenario. So this is important because we can look at ability-based design, and it's asking us to ask these questions like, well, what context is someone using this device or this system? What is the environment like at this time when they're doing these things? And if we can understand something around these different variables, we can make our systems more accessible as a result. And I wanted to end with this last thing here about ability-based design, which I think is really useful, and it's called the positive affirmation of ability. So what they're saying here is that everyone has abilities, some people more than others. And what's really important is that we need to design for people with abilities of all types. So that's kind of like this main takeaway is, once again, foreground ability, make ability the thing that you're trying to design for. So that's kind of my spiel on how I think about accessibility and accessibility research. And so now I kind of want to just talk about like my general research approach. So typically what I do is I like to evaluate what we call these ability assumptions. So an ability assumption. So if you think about this, all human operated technologies contain embedded ability assumptions, whether explicit or implicit. So that's every technology, not just computer technologies, but anything that's been made by humans, anything that's been designed by humans, is going to have these assumptions embedded in them that are going to dictate how people are expected to use them or how people can use them. And it's really important that when we think about technologies and when we're designing new technologies or trying to understand how to make past technologies more accessible, is we really need to understand at the core of them, what are the ability assumptions? What are we anticipating people can do, or what are we expecting people to be able to do when they interact with these technologies? And we need to understand how those expectations and how all those assumptions are actually creating systems and applications that are actually preventing people from being able to use it, and it can actually be quite exclusionary. So for my dissertation work, I looked at the ability assumptions and kind of embedded inside the kind of what you would think of as just like a touchscreen device. So there are some things that we just kind of take for granted, right? The affordances of a touchscreen and how they and what they allow us to do. So we assume that we can do things just like, you know, you can tap with a single finger. If you want to select a target, you can like both lift and land inside of it. You could perform both, you know, two finger and single finger gestures like a swipe or pinch to zoom or things like that. But what I found in my research is that people actually use all different types of ways to interact with the touchscreen. So this is a research study that we did back in, I think, 2015, because it was published in 2016. But we essentially created this test bed and we just asked people that, hey, touch this crosshair that's placed on the screen, but touch it in whichever way is most comfortable and natural to you. Like, and this is all with people with limited mobility, primarily people with cerebral palsy. We did this study at a place in Seattle called Provale, which used to be United Cerebral Palsy Center. And essentially what we find is, you know, like, hey, people might touch the screen with multiple fingers, kind of like the way this participant is showing now. So they're kind of hitting the crosshair on the screen, kind of using their thumb as kind of like the primary pointing implement, but still interacting with the screen with various fingers, which in a normal case would actually be really inaccurate for the system because it's not expecting all of those touch input points. And you can also see people do different types of like dragging their hands and different types of behaviors, right? So this is a person who's kind of using the screen for stability and is kind of dragging their hand towards the crosshair. It's kind of doing a little dwell and then kind of moving their hand back. So essentially this project was part of this one piece of the project was part of a bigger research goal, which was like to understand how can we model touch behavior. So if we can understand the touch behaviors that people use when they're interacting with touchscreen devices, then we can train touchscreen systems to respond more accurately to people's innate touch behaviors. And we can make these systems more accessible as a result. But part of it comes from understanding these ability assumptions, right? And not just going in and expecting people to interact with the system the way you want them to, or the way you expect them to. People are going to do things that work for them, and we need to make those things work for them in turn. So kind of my general research approach here when I approach a new problem is I really try to identify and question what these ability assumptions are. So whatever technology I'm working on, either if I'm developing a new technology or trying to retrofit a past technology, this is a really important question to look at is what are the ability assumptions? And then I consider myself like an input and interaction person. I get really excited about thinking about ways to create new input schemes and interaction methods to allow people to interact with computing devices in ways that maybe they weren't able to before. So based off this notion of understanding what these assumptions are and understanding what people could do, then I can take that knowledge and actually start to create interaction techniques that are actually more accessible to people. And then the last part is actually, evaluating the things we build with target users, which is like, probably don't have to say it to this group, very important. If you actually want to create technologies that work with people with cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy or Parkinson's, it's really important to actually then go out and not only do the co-design with them, but then actually do the evaluation so that you can actually get an accurate representation of how well your system works or your interaction techniques work in this case. Okay, so that was kind of like the background portion of the talk. So a little bit about how I think about accessibility, and a little bit about my past research and how things are going. So what I'm going to talk about now is some of the research that my group has been doing. So me primarily for some of these projects, but my group in general, what we've been doing around trying to make virtual reality more accessible. Like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it's been really difficult to try to do this work the way we want to, given the restrictions of COVID-19 and all of that entails. I think when you work with people with disabilities, it's really important to do these co-design kind of activities and actually be able to observe people interact with devices, actually be able to be there and collect data in a much more rich kind of way. So what I'm going to talk about now is some of the kind of initial stuff that we've been doing, kind of, given all of the limitations that we have around COVID. But my real hope from this conversation is that some of the problems that I might identify, you might be really interested in, and it might make you actually think about virtual reality, or more broadly, how spatial computing and things like that might be inaccessible to people with disabilities. It might motivate you, or, encourage you all to think about, doing some research in this space. So that's kind of the hope I'm going to have from doing this part of the talk. So just really brief kind of like background on virtual reality. So most people probably in this call are probably familiar with VR. It's an immersive technology that allows people to be embodied in different experiences and to, navigate and explore different type of virtual environments. It offers a lot of benefits over traditional kind of 2D computing devices like, desktop or mobile systems. Really, this level of immersion and presence and embodiment is really something that is really hard to replicate in a traditional computing sense. So, virtual reality, primarily used for gaming. I think that's kind of like the biggest market for it right now, but you can also use it for things like medical training, architectural walkthroughs. So the point I wanted to make here is that, virtual reality just probably won't be just a technology that's just used for gaming and entertainment. It's not too hard to believe that actually, people for their jobs and their professions and their educational scenarios are actually going to be using virtual reality for a lot of different types of applications and use cases. So it's really important to think about how we can make these things accessible, because if the devices and applications aren't accessible, then those experiences as a result won't be accessible either. So there's been an explosion kind of like really like in the last 5 or 6 years in a number of kind of commercial VR systems that are available. So and I have the whole like Oculus family of devices. HTC now kind of has the Vive and the Cosmos and a couple of devices. And then Windows also has a mixed reality platform that companies like Acer and I think like HP also kind of have their own type of VR headsets that's running the Windows mixed reality platform. So this is an interesting point to really get into this space, because VR isn't in its infancy anymore. People have been doing VR research for decades, but it also hasn't reached this kind of like mass production or mass adoption yet. So there's still tons of people who haven't had the opportunity to try VR. VR systems are still going to be changing in form factors and sizes and things like that. But it's really an opportunity to think about accessibility before this perhaps potential mass adoption occurs. So like what I'll be talking about. So there's this notion like, VR is really great for a lot of things, but virtual reality really does has an accessibility problem. So this is a screen grab of a little clip that I have from a Scientific American article in which it says, virtual reality has been touted as an empathy machine that lets users see what it's like to have a disability, but people with disabilities often can't use it. So it's this notion here that virtual reality can have potential, for example, for empathy training and things like that, but people with disabilities themselves often can't have access to these systems. So a paper that I co-wrote along with a bunch of other people at Microsoft Research. We wrote this paper at the ISMAR conference in 2019 called Accessible by Design: An Opportunity for Virtual Reality. And what we tried to do is actually try to lay out the case for, well, when we're thinking about virtual reality systems and how we want to make them accessible, what are really some of the things that we should be focusing on? And so where should our priorities be, and how should we think about what we're doing in this space to make these things more accessible? So we identified kind of 5 key areas of focus: content accessibility, interaction accessibility, device accessibility, inclusive representations, and application diversity. So I'm going to touch on most of these in this talk here, but for this first part, I'm actually going to just focus on the interaction accessibility and the device accessibility as it relates primarily to people with limited mobility. So first is device accessibility. So one of the reasons why VR is so inaccessible is because the devices that we have to use as to implement to interact with the underlying experiences and applications like I mentioned before, make a lot of assumptions about users and their abilities. And this facilitates the needs for more customizable hardware, but also more just accessible hardware in terms of looking at things that people can do already. So like, what devices do people already use? And then how can we integrate that with more accessible technologies? So when we think about VR accessibility, there's this, or when we think about VR in general, there's this really strong urge to actually want to make things kind of like as realistic as possible, to really embed the user inside the virtual environment and have really tight mappings between what the user can do and what the system does in turn inside the virtual reality system. But if the devices that we use to actually be able to create this level of immersion aren't accessible to people, then the whole system kind of breaks down. So we need to think about ways to actually make the devices accessible to people, because if they're not, they won't be able to engage in the systems in the first place. So there's been some work that's looked at this for people who are blind, for example. So this is a project called the Canetroller that was done at Microsoft Research a few years ago, that was led by an intern, Yuang, who's now a professor at University of Wisconsin. Essentially, we're looking at, well, how can you make interactions inside VR more accessible to people who are blind? Well, you can actually create custom hardware to allow people to have these kind of tactile sensations or feelings when they're actually interacting inside of a virtual world. So this was a great project that Alexa actually came a couple of years ago and actually worked on kind of like a follow-up to this project and actually made some really great improvements. So this is like one really interesting and really useful way of thinking about device accessibility. It's like, well, how can we create new things that allow people to have new experiences? When I joined the team, like I mentioned before, for my dissertation research, I was really looking at things from standpoint of limited mobility. So when we came into this, I was really looking at these type of questions. Well, what accessibility barriers do people with limited mobility encounter when using VR systems? So like just commercial VR systems, what barriers might they encounter? And then for people who have used VR systems, what strategies have they employ to try to overcome some of these accessibility barriers? So to help us answer these questions, we ran this interview study. We had 16 participants with limited mobility. We had a mix of in-person and remote interviews, and we had a couple of people with prior VR experience. The VR experience was nice to have, but we didn't want to over-index on that because it's just really hard to find people who have either used VR and have found it accessible to them. So for the people who were actually in person that came in and did the study, and the people didn't have prior VR experience, we actually gave them an opportunity to try out these 3 different VR apps. So one is like Allspace VR, it's like a social VR environment. Oculus First Contact, you could think of it as like a tutorial type of thing to teaching you how to use hand-tracked controllers and things. And then Google Earth VR, which we just thought could be an interesting application for people to play around with to get a sense of how they like the VR experience. So from this paper that we published at Assets just last year, the conference was in October, we essentially identified what we call these like 7 VR accessibility barriers. So things like setting up a VR system, putting on and taking off an HMD, adjusting the HMD head strap, cord management, manipulating dual motion controllers, inaccessible buttons, and maintaining view of the controllers were things that we identified as just, hey, if somebody wants to be able to interact with a VR system, just kind of like once they open the box, here are some of the issues that they're going to have to deal with when trying to think about some of these kind of concerns. So I'm going to talk not about all of these, but I just kind of want to highlight a couple. And some of these you might look at it, might be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but why is that a concern, or why is that like an HCI problem? So for example, we could just look at things like, adjusting the HMD head strap, and you can kind of tie this in more broadly with putting on and taking off the HMD. So in terms of like design and how we think about these things, there's just some like functional design things. So for example, this P1 said, one thing I noticed is that the back strap thing is thick, so it touches like my headrest. So a headrest that might be included on a wheelchair or a power wheelchair. So that makes it difficult for this person to move their head, for example. So just the way that this thing is designed, and it wasn't necessarily thought about how you would design this so that it will work well for someone who's seated in the wheelchair, can actually make it, in their case, difficult for them to move their head and have these other interactions. But it also kind of just speaks to this broader question that you can have of, well, like, hey, how do we create more accessible type of like wearable technologies more broadly for people with physical disabilities? So it's not just a question of how can I have something that might interfere with my headset. There are people who might have difficulty raising their arms above their chest, for example, or lifting their hands above their head. So if we have these technologies that presume a certain level of control and a certain level of autonomy, how does that break down then if people then have to understand how people can't use this in a way that they may have wanted to because the technology just wasn't designed in a way that makes it accessible to them? Like, we need to think more broadly around the design of these technologies, not just for HMDs, but other types of wearable technologies that might be excluding people with physical disabilities from taking part. So this other one that is more relevant to some of the research I'm going to talk about after this is, so this thought about manipulating dual motion controllers. So unlike in a traditional desktop computing sense, where it's kind of like, you kind of have one pointing implement as the main focus of control. So you either have like a mouse or a trackball, or you're using your finger on a touchscreen. In a VR environment, you could have two controllers and use both hands to do different things at different times. But that could also be challenging for people with limited mobility. So one of these quotes here from participant 14 said, I can only use one hand for the controller. So I use my right hand to control one of the sticks. And I think having the one-handed barrier is quite common for people who have strokes. And then another participant, P2 here, that said, like, I just wouldn't use it too much or requires coordination. It could be really frustrating. And kind of in tandem with this is this notion that, hey, these controllers themselves aren't just used for like their motion tracking capabilities. People also have to interact with the individual buttons and things on them to actually, perform these interactions. So we have one participant here, P6, and this is kind of represented in the image here. It's saying it's like, yeah, I think walking was pushing down. So this is walking in a virtual environment. So you push one of the joysticks down. And then to do that, I had to use two hands and leave the other controller to do it. As soon as I heard that you have to push it down, I was like, yep, nope, that's not happening. And that's primarily because people might have low strength, for example, in their hands, or low dexterity. So if you're expecting people to be able to hold and manipulate multiple buttons at the same time while still holding this controller, like participant 6 said, that might not be possible for them. They might actually have to like stop what they're doing, put another controller down, and then use both hands to just press down the joystick, right? So when we ask people kind of like, well, what would be some things that you might want to see? Like what would make these experiences more accessible to you? So some people mention things like, well, just like alternative input controls, right? So if we can't make this assumption that everyone who's going to use a virtual reality system is going to have kind of the availability to them of having two kind of 6 degrees of freedom tracked controllers that they can use all the time, how could we do things with people? How can we do these interactions with devices that people already use? So if someone uses a quad stick, or they use a series of switches or a trackball, what's the possibility for that? And then other ones is like, well, how can we use other different types of input modalities? So how could we use gaze input or voice input to allow more accessible VR manipulations? But even with gaze and voice, we're still not there yet in terms of understanding how would somebody, for example, fully control a VR interface or interact inside of a VR environment using strictly gaze or using strictly voice. Is something that we're just not sure yet how to make all of those interactions accessible given the more limited input modalities that might be available to some people. So one possibility, and I think that's really good, and I know Patrick Carrington was here earlier in the quarter, is to think about chairable computing. So this is this idea that, chairable computing is really this technology that takes advantage of the space on or around a wheelchair, as much as, kind of like leveraging on-body and warm mobile technology is what wearable computing can do. So essentially the idea is, well, how can we bring interfaces and the devices closer to people so that these devices can actually then sit on places that are actually really useful and really beneficial to the person who's using them. So one thing that we were looking at here, the title of the slide is wrong. So forget the accessible bimanual input part, that's coming later. The question that we're actually looking at here is this, well, how do we leverage more traditional 2D input devices, things that could fit more comfortably on the form factor of a wheelchair to, complete more complex spatial interactions? So one thing we looked at, and we thought was actually like a good example of this, is like virtual hand manipulations. So in a VR environment, you could use these touch controllers to perform different type of hand manipulation. So you could do things like make a thumbs up or grasp a cube and use the controller to like throw it or just drop it, toss it in different directions. So this is something in which there's no really good design schemes right now to say, well, how would I use a commodity input device like a joystick and a switch to be able to perform all these various types of virtual hand manipulations? It's something that, prior work that's looking at like the design space of input devices, for example, doesn't really have great answers for in terms of saying, hey, we have these complex interactions. Here's how you might want to map this input device to this complex interaction. So for example, for this, we did like a user elicitation study where we got 21 participants with limited mobility. Once again, this is happening in COVID time, so we weren't able to actually do this in person, but we actually did was use the CrowdLicit platform that Abdullah Ali and others created to actually be able to do this like remote user elicitation study. So we created 16 hand manipulations as reference, and what we did was we showed them each of these kind of like little short videos, slightly longer than the video you see right now, the thumbs up. And we just asked people, hey, how would you use different types of input devices to be able to perform this gesture, for example? So in our study that I'm going to talk about now, it's like, we asked people, it's like, hey, if you use a touchpad, it can sense multiple concurrent touch points. How would you use that to perform these type of gestures? And some of the things that we found initially, to analyze, before we get to that, to analyze this, what we did was we looked at the taxonomy of surface gestures by Robrock et al. That looked at, okay, hey, we can analyze different gestures that people make on a touchscreen to understand kind of how people's mental models of these gestures actually work. So some initial findings, for example, that we have around this that speaks to these notions of mental models, for example, are we looked at like discrete hand gestures. So we had things in our set of 16 total that were like 4 discrete hand gestures. So this kind of like, index plus extended finger, closing a fist, a thumbs up. And what we found was that when we were analyzing people's answers for how they would perform these gestures, 41%, which was the most popular or the most common results, were abstract gestures. So abstract gestures are ones in which there's really no mapping between what the person does with the gesture and how that relates to what the actual referent or the end result is going to be. So in this case, we had people doing a lot of things, for example, like, to make a thumbs up, I might tap on the screen 3 times consecutively, or I might do a tap and then a swirl or something. But those gestures don't have really any indication of what's going on with the actual hand. And you compare that to these kind of like grasp and release gestures, hand manipulations that we looked at. 57% of those were metaphorical. So meaning that the gesture actually is more tightly bound or tightly related to what the actual hand manipulation is doing. So an example of that, for example, is we can look at these dichotomous referents. So meaning that there's the same reference, but kind of like in reverse in some situation. So for example, we can have an action that's just like, well, how would you grasp an object using this virtual hand? And then we can ask, well, how would you release it? And this speaks to this kind of metaphorical gestures that people were referring to. So somebody, P16, for example, would say, to grasp the cube, they said they would squeeze their fingers on the touchpad together to grab the object. And then to release, they would kind of just do the opposite or the reverse of the grasp gesture, which in this case would just be to extend their fingers to release. So this is a study that we've actually been really interested in. It's something that we think is really useful. Here's kind of a diagram that shows all the 16 different hand manipulations that we implemented. And it's useful because what we want to be able to understand here, and kind of different than what you might do in a typical user elicitation study, is where you actually want to come up with some type of consensus and say like, hey, this is the gesture that would work really well to perform this action. People with disabilities have so many different ways that they interact with objects, and they do things typically to relate well to their own ability. So we're not necessarily looking for consensus and saying like, hey, this is what people are using. But what we're instead looking for is like, well, what are these mental models? Like, so, are there categories of different hand manipulations that might be harder for people to understand how they would actually implement those? So for example, what we found was that these translation ones, so like move forward, move backwards, people were able to come up with really easy gestures for those, because they might say just directional swipes, for example, might be good enough for people to understand like, okay, if I want to move something backwards or forwards, I might just swipe up and down for that interaction. But like I mentioned before, these kind of more discrete gesture type of things in which there's not a really great mental models for, like how do you do a thumbs up on a touchpad? We might have to think about ways that create more accessible mappings for those different types of interactions. So this is like one example of ways that we need to think about how commodity input devices can be used in a way to create much more complex expressive interactions when we actually get to VR and different type of augmented reality interfaces. So some of the takeaways that we had from not just the study that I just mentioned, but the assets paper, this actually comes from the assets paper. So just a couple of things in terms of design. So one thing that's really important is this notion like designing for interdependence. So interdependence is kind of a design framework in which you don't think about how a person would do something independently. You actually try to understand and acknowledge that people with disabilities often work with other people a lot of the times to do different things. So people might work with caregivers and friends and families for lots of different interactions. And what we heard from our participants was that, hey, when thinking about how to create more accessible VR systems, just don't think about the one user, the one person. Think about the ecosystem that that person is in. How could you help, or how could you involve caregivers and family members in the process to make these devices and systems more accessible to them, like how people work together to do certain things. Design for customization really comes to this question of saying, we really need input controls and interaction methods that people can really take advantage of, create more bespoke solutions. But at the development level, we really need to think about how to enable that level of flexibility and control. Design for accessibility. So this is really just meaning more towards like ability, right? So if you're thinking about different ways that people might use a system, you really want to put the ability part first and really put that in the foreground. And then the last one is this design for diversity. One of the things that came up in our interviews with participants was that people felt that there was this expectation that, if something was was inaccessible to them, that was kind of like, okay, like it was just like, well, this wasn't made for you. Like, why would you want it to be a part of this experience? This is an experience for people who can walk, or experience for people who can throw. And if you can't walk or throw, then you shouldn't want to be able to engage in these experiences. But we found is that, like, people want to interact with VR systems in all types of ways. So don't kind of make the assumption that like, hey, what matters the most is just immersion, or what matters the most is embodiment in these certain situations. Really consider what people want and how they're going to interact in these different types of situations. So the next thing I want to talk about is this notion of interaction accessibility. So like I mentioned, and when we talked about device accessibility, VR, much more than these traditional systems, think about physical input and output. And it's really bad in terms of understanding how people with limited mobility can translate what their physical actions are into the actions that the system can interpret and use in a way to make their interactions easier and more enjoyable to use. So when we make these VR inputs and outputs, like when we increase the fidelity of them, essentially what we're doing is that we're importing a lot of the things that are inaccessible about the physical world, and we're importing them into the virtual world. So if there is an action or something that was hard for you to do in the virtual world, but if in the real world, but now the virtual world expects you to perform that action the same exact way, we're just now making the virtual world just as inaccessible as the real world. So we need to really think about these inaccessible methods and user interfaces that can work well for these more accessible devices that we also create. So another example of this for people who are blind or low vision is this system called SeeingVR, which is essentially this collection of enhancements that will allow people with limited vision to be able to have more accessible interactions in VR by doing things like having edge enhancement, having magnification lenses, things like that. And again, where I'm really looking for it is how does this work for people with limited mobility? So I was really interested in this question of accessible bimanual input, and one of the participants actually has this quote. So in talking about using two hands to perform actions in VR, they said, I'm not sure that that would be possible for me to do them simultaneously. If I had to do, I could do it one-handed, but if I had to do both hands at the same time, that's not going to work. So you might have people, for example, who are amputees that might have access to one arm or one hand. You might have people who might have more strength or more movement in one hemisphere of their body compared to the other. So people might prefer to just use a single controller to be able to do these input manipulations. But then the question becomes, well, how do we do these kind of like complex bimanual input actions if I just have a single input modality? So this is the question we asked. So I had a great intern, Momona Yamagami, who's a PhD candidate at University of Washington, who was an intern with me last summer, and we kind of explored some of these areas. So once again, it's, how can we allow people to control bimanual interfaces with unimanual input? So what we did is we started off with this kind of popular framework, the Guillard framework for this asymmetric division of labor. So what this really tells us is that, like, hey, we can really think about it as like, there's only really a few types of bimanual interactions. So there's symmetric interface in which both hands do the same role at the same time. So you could think of that as like jump roping. Both hands are kind of like working in tandem to do the same action. Symmetric out of phase is that both hands do the same action, but at different times. So if you're thinking about something like climbing a rope or a ladder, one hand might go and then the other hand might go. So both hands are doing the same action, just at different times. Asymmetric coordinated is when both hands are working together on like a single object. So you could think of that as something like, you're cutting an apple. One hand holds the apple while the other hand is kind of actually doing the slicing. And then you can think of asymmetric uncoordinated as two hands are just doing two different things and they're not coordinated with each other. So that could be like in a gaming scenario, it could be, you hold a shield with your left hand and you hold a sword with your right hand. And in theory, you could bash in one direction with the shield while swiping with the sword. So there's really no way to identify kind of what the two things are doing. So if you're really thinking about like, well, how can we create interaction techniques for this space? Well, you can maybe think about it along the spectrum of like, well, how much autonomy do you want the user to have, right? So you can really think of it's like, okay, if I have a spectrum between less autonomy to more autonomy, what can I do with that? So with less autonomy in terms of the user actually having some input in what's going to happen, maybe you say, hey, if the user encounters a bimanual task, we just automatically perform the task for them, or we give them the option to automatically perform the task. So that could be something like, hey, you encounter a ladder, you could just automatically climb the ladder. We're not going to have you do the two-handed interaction piece. Similarly, if you want something that's more in the middle, you can maybe do something where you actually infer the output of the two hands giving input from the one hand. So if I know what one hand is doing, could I then infer what the other hand should be doing based off the input that I'm getting from the one hand? And then if you really want to give people a lot of autonomy, maybe you could do something like use an alternative input method. So maybe you could use the headset or the eye gaze as something to compensate for not having the other hand. So what you could do then is, whatever designs or interaction techniques you come up with on the spectrum from less to more autonomy, then you can kind of overlay those with, what's happening with these different type of interaction methods. So in this case, I'm going to go through an example of saying like, okay, well, if I had automatic inferring or alternative, what does that look like for symmetric out of phase interactions? So for example, if I wanted to infer the location of a virtual hand in this symmetric out of phase thing, perhaps what I'll do is I'll create a system in which the virtual hand kind of always just mimics the direction, speed, and distance of what the real hand is doing. So if the real hand performs some movement up to climb the ladder and then went a certain distance, I'll just have the virtual hand mimic that interaction by going the same distance and speed and everything else. And then I could just have it snap to kind of like whatever the closest like interactable object is. So the benefits of that is like, it could be less fatigue. It can be, you could perform more movement simultaneously, but once again, the user has less control. And then similarly, maybe for the alternative input, you say things like, hey, well, the real hand is going to operate this, but let's say I want to use like the HO headset to identify the location of the virtual hand. So this can give you more autonomy or control. You can perform more movements. But if you really want to get into complex interactions, your alternative input might need similar degrees of freedom as the hand. You could have issues with overloading, and it could be not as accessible as to some users. So an example of that could be this situation here. So on the right is Momona, and she's essentially using climbing kind of like with one hand, and then what she's doing is using kind of the location of the HMD, kind of like the gaze offset of or the head tract offset of the HMD to be able to understand where the next virtual hand should go. So this could be like a really great way to say like, hey, if you only have one hand available to you, great. We could just, use some other different type of input device and use that as a way to then control what the other hand should be doing. Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip that because I'm running low on time here and I want to get to questions and answers. So I just kind of want to talk about future opportunities, the part of the Accessible by Design paper that I really have a chance to get into. So just really briefly, so the other ones on the list were content accessibility. So this is really looking at ways to say like, hey, we don't really have agreed upon methods to make content accessible in VR. And we don't, and there's trickle down effects to that. So we don't know what type of metadata is necessary. We're not sure what standards we should have. And then we're also not sure how we can allow people to apply these accessibility options post hoc. So these are all things in terms of like, well, how do we actually make the content of a VR environment? So you could think of something like a 3D video, for example. Like how would you make a 3D video accessible to somebody who might be blind or low vision, or to somebody with limited mobility who can't move their head to see what's going on in the scene? There's this other thing here about inclusive representations, which is really important. So this idea that, VR has a lot of embodied experiences and the people usually embody these type of virtual avatars. So what's the question then of how do people with disabilities want to be represented in these spaces? How does that embodiment work if your avatar has very different abilities than what you possess? So if you're a person who uses a wheelchair and doesn't walk, but you have to embody an avatar that does walk and has use of both hands and things like that, is that actually an immersive experience for that person? Does that actually create something that they find enjoyable, or would they actually prefer different types of mappings, different types of representations? And then the last thing here is really about like application diversity. So VR provides these opportunities to kind of do different types of application types. So you could do things like virtual orientation and mobility training for people who are blind or low vision. You could recreate a virtual city and have them actually, practice navigating, walking to work or walk into a new doctor's office or something without them actually having to do it in person. You can democratize rehabilitation and physical therapy more easily. And then you can also think about virtualizing existing digital tasks. So instead of having something like 20 actual physical monitors to get as much screen space as you can, maybe just replace all these physical monitors with virtual monitors. And does that make things more accessible to people? Because then they have more control over how they move this virtual content compared to this physical content. So just kind of to wrap up in conclusion here, really, kind of what I wanted to talk today about and demonstrate was just that, people with limited mobility are going to encounter a lot of accessibility barriers when interacting with VR systems. And it's really important to really be mindful and think about what barriers they may encounter and how we can really start to designing more accessible systems. And not just like accessible in terms of like compliance, not just like, hey, a person can do this thing, so I just called it quits. Like, how do you really create enjoyable, immersive, expressive experiences in VR? For people with disabilities. And when you're designing this, like think about ability. When you're designing these interactive systems, focus on what people can do and leverage that as much as possible. And then I really try to ensure that these systems are designed to promote equity for people with disabilities moving forward. So that's it for me. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Martez.
Yeah, thank you.
For panelists, feel free to just submit questions. Panelists, feel free to unmute and just ask questions. For those who are in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions on the Google form and I'll proxy them. Just to start out with one, traditional accessibility research tends to go for software solutions to software oversights, right? The software has been designed with some very strong ability assumptions, and then they're too strong, right? They're not the right ones. And what I see in your talk is software responses to both software, but also hardware oversights. So I'm just kind of curious about, well, what should we be doing on the hardware side, right? If you were to give it sort of free rein to redesign hardware for VR, would you have wound up at the same sort of destination for the thing that, Oculus, et cetera, should have deployed? Or would you have wound up with something quite different, and what would it have looked like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say you would definitely round up with something much different. I mean, I think the input devices. So one of the things that we're trying to leverage in the work that we're looking at is how can we take input devices that people already have familiarity with, they're already experts in that, and how can we leverage those to the biggest extent possible? So for example, there's people who use like quad sticks, like so people who might be paralyzed from the neck down, who you might use quad sticks, sip and puff devices, things like that. And the question would be, okay, well, we have these kind of more lower fidelity input devices. And if the question is, well, how do you make those work in these kind of more complex scenarios? And the question and answer right now is just like, we're still just not sure. I think that a lot of the things that we're having around these type of assumptions are that like, hey, I'm expecting that you can move your body in such a way and that your kind of body will take over these like more implicit interactions, right? And I think that what we're trying to figure out is how can we create things that allow people to customize their setups to the greatest extent possible? So an idea, for example, might be if a person has limited upper body mobility, but let's say they can actually move their legs and feet quite well, why not give them the opportunity to say, put motion tracked kind of devices on their feet instead, and now they can use their feet as kind of like a proxy for what the hand control should be, and instead just use that input modality instead. And then similarly, other people may not be able to use their feet, but maybe they can use something else. So then maybe they're saying like, oh, maybe I will put this on my shoulders or somewhere else where they have a lot of degrees of freedom of control. So I think it's really going to be about how can we democratize the availability of input devices to the greatest extent possible, and then how can we, once we understand what the possible range of input devices are, how can we then start creating more accessible interaction techniques and things like that on top of those to take advantage of them to the best extent possible?
One who's asking, have you noticed any differences in studying accessibility in AR versus accessibility in VR? And what are the considerations between the two types?
Yes, that's a great question. So I haven't done a lot of explicit investigation of this. Mostly, like I said before, the COVID pandemic has really hampered our ability to actually be able to, go to people with disabilities and actually understand their preferences and, what things they do in real life. But I will say, like, for example, one of the differences is that, in the virtual reality environment, the developers in some sense control everything. Every pixel is in some way generated for some action. So we can have a lot more control over a virtual reality environment, where as in augmented reality, there's a tighter fit between the physical world and the digital content. So for example, you might have a set of digital content that you've anchored to a physical object. So like, hey, when I look at this table, I'm going to see this content, but I actually have to be near this table to actually get access to it. So things like, how do I access content that might be spatially far from me is a problem that in the AR environment you would definitely think about. But in the VR environment, we could come up with all of these different ways to kind of like overcome that, right? We can make people's like arms stretch really far, or we can like really just like expand the screen or rotate the environment around them. But if I'm here and there's really something over there that I need access to, and if I can't either physically get there, or if there's other things that are keeping that information from being accessible to me, that's going to be a problem. And I still think that there's this broader notion of spatial computing or spatial input, in which, if we're expecting AR systems to be able to use like hand tracking, for example. So like on the latest HoloLens 2 from Microsoft, there's a lot of great hand tracking features that they have there where people can actually use their hands to manipulate the holograms. But once again, what if you're a person who doesn't have the fine motor control in your hands to be able to perform these interactions? Then what's the opportunity, right? Like, well, how do we then make those interactions accessible to you, even though the kind of default, implement wouldn't work well for that person?
Michael, can I jump in with a question here? So I have the luxury of getting to meet with you in the next half hour. So I'm asking a question that's for the students who are on the line, because I think you presented so many amazing ideas. For those of us who are actually building and studying and this on a daily basis, what do you think are a couple just low-hanging fruit starting points? So many good ideas. Like, we've got people here that can test a lot of these. Where can we help?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So I think there's one thing that, for example, that we're really interested in is understanding this kind of like ecology of devices and understanding how best to implement those and use those within a VR scenario. So I think there's always this push and motivation or drive to say like, well, how can we create something new? How can we create something that's hasn't been done before. And I think, for example, a lot of people in the disability community are like, this thing works really well for me. If I could use this thing like all the time for all these different situations, I would prefer to do that. So part of it is like understanding like, hey, if a person uses a quad stick or a sip and puff device, and we're just like, use that as like just a constraint and say like, hey, a person who's paralyzed from their neck down uses this device implement and they still want to be able to have a great VR experience. Like, what does that look like? How can we really take this like device of one or user of one type of scenario and then really start to think about how to design those type of situations for them? I think, for example, if you're interested in working with solutions for people who are like blind or have low vision, I think there's still these like really open questions around like, how do you create like what is like the screen reader equivalent for like a VR environment? Like, what's the voiceover that's going to exist when people start to think about VR scenario? So I wouldn't necessarily say these are like low hanging fruit in terms of like how you would actually get to solutions for these. But I think that in terms of just like the problem space, I think kind of like trying to identify how we can best leverage what people can use right now, and then try to understand how that can be leveraged in a VR or an AR context, I think could be quite useful to people. And then I think once we kind of have that understanding, then I think we can actually start building on top of that and actually then start to think about different ways to create systems on top of that. So like for a really brief example, one things that we're trying to partner with another research team at MSR, they have this platform that they call JackDAC, which is essentially this hardware platform that allows people to be able to plug just any different type of input module into it. So the idea could be, for example, how could we democratize what we think about what is a controller really? Like if we think about as a controller, it's just like this prefabricated set of buttons and triggers and joysticks and things like that. But if somebody can say like, what, actually I want a platform in which I could put things like near my headrest so I could go like this to be able to hit things. I want to be able to put things near my feet so when I hit them, these things happen. So how can we kind of like, expand our role of what we think the input ecology could look like to be more accessible and inclusive to people? I think could be really powerful.
I have a comment sort of related to what you just said. It seemed like as you were laying out your framework, a lot of it was about input. Yeah. When you said do, it was largely what people could, move and cause to happen as inputs to a system, whereas a lot of times accessibility is about ability to sense. And so you get the blind or low vision, the deaf or hard of hearing, and so forth. Do you have any thoughts about how VR is useful in one versus the other, or how you would make things accessible and available to people with the input disabilities versus the output disabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think they're both tricky. So I think like, so for example, for some of these kind of like output kind of questions, for example, with people with different sensory disabilities. So for example, if you take sound, for example, and one way we might think about, well, how do we make sound more accessible in a virtual reality context could be doing things like, we can actually have these kind of like different types of augmentations or substitutions. So how can I take something that's available in one sense and then augment it or substitute it with a sense that a person does possess? So if a person's deaf or hard of hearing and we want to make the sound that's available in the VR environment more accessible to them, well, how can we take that output channel and then transfer that to something that's more tactile or haptic, or how can we turn it into something that's more visual, but not in a way that like is too overwhelming or overloading to the person on the screen and be able to do these different things. And I think similarly for people who are blind or low vision, in which you might say like, well, how do you describe a complex virtual scene to someone who's blind? Like what's the nature of that interaction? I think right now with 2D interfaces, we have this kind of more like scanning type of mental model of it, where it's like, okay, you start at kind of like the top of the document and you kind of go down and you go across lists or tables or things like that. But if I just have an entire virtual world ahead of me, how do I present that information to a person who's blind and know like, well, what are they trying to look for? What's important to them? What's the most relevant thing? Is it based off the environment, or is it based off the task they're trying to perform? Is it based off the the people around them and how that's going to influence what they can do. So it's not something that I'm more interested in like the input side and just in terms of the research I do. But I know a lot of people are thinking about these kind of like more like output questions that you ask, and like for people with different sensory disabilities, what can we do in that space? So I think it's something that people are working on, but I think there's still a lot of open questions there.
Thanks. I notice we're coming to the end of the hour, so I'll just sort of summarize as food for thought some of the other questions that came in. We got a question about non-physical ability differences, like people who are dealing with trauma, fight or flight responses. We had a question about design process, thinking about how one would go about creating these experiences if you don't have direct access to people with limited ability to develop empathy or test with. We have a question around balancing accessibility and commercial interests, and so on. So a few other questions, but we'd all like to thank you, Martez, for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you and either in person or remotely as the future portends. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And then if anyone has any questions or wants to collaborate anything, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk to people. So